His land was green and good.
It's been known for some time now that the RPG company Modiphius has had the license to do a proper actual Barsoom RPG. Now, the story of Barsoom and role-playing games is a long and complicated one, but to very, very briefly go over it, in most countries, most of the books that form the original series are in public domain, apart from the last couple. In Australia, they're all in public domain. And this has led, at various times, various people to try and do various things with Edgar Rice Burroughs' work, because most of it's in the public domain and people really like them and want to do something with them. Gary Gygax originally did a tabletop war game based around it until they had to stop under pressure from ERB Inc., Edgar Rice Burroughs Inc. Now, ERB, are known for being particularly litigious and bullying, so even though a lot of this material is in the public domain, it is often very difficult to do anything with it, just sheerly on the fact that they will hound you with lawyers and demands and so on, and make it really not worth your while to do anything with it. So that's been a big problem. I considered doing something with it at one point via the public domain until I was warned off. Gareth Michael Skarka, for all he's a bellend, also tried to do something with it and got a lot of pressure and ended up releasing an RPG called Mars, which unfortunately, if I remember correctly, uses Savage Worlds, which I'm not too keen on as a generic RPG, and it doesn't play that well for that, for whatever reason. I don't know why. My prejudices against Gareth notwithstanding, I thought he did a really good effort with Mars. It just doesn't work for me. And there's other imitations and things that people have done over the years of Sword and Planet as a genre and so on, but it just lacks that something that Barsoom has. There's been various other attempts over the years. There was an attempt at a D20 version that stopped and vanished, and so it goes. Various Kickstarters of people who didn't really know what they were doing have turned up and then stopped, and this has been the case. But here comes Modiphius, and they've had other licenses before to do other things similarly, and they do a good workmanlike job. And I'm going to back the Kickstarter because I am a sucker, and I love Barsoom and Pulp novels and all of that planetary romance stuff, all the rest of it. I love it to bits. So whatever the problems are going to be, I'm still going to back it. But I do have some concerns related to how Modiphius has handled other properties that I really like, with some timidity, it feels like to me. So now I've got nothing against Modiphius other than they haven't employed me for anything despite being a British RPG company. They've done a lot of good work, a lot of good games. They seem to have their Kickstarter thing down. It's all good, but it's in the execution that I have some problems. So take Dust, for example. I'm mad about Dust. It's kind of faded into the background due to a bad Kickstarter and some issues with model production and so on, people basically vanishing with the money and so on. But it's this pulpy alternative World War II setting with mechs and hyper-evolved, uplifted gorillas and zombie soldiers and stuff, and it's brilliant and it's pulpy, and a huge part of it is the kind of pin-up bomber girl aesthetic. It's really present in the books, it's really present in the characters, in the heroes and heroines and so on, and it's part of that whole look of the thing. It's kind of World War II meets rockabilly in a lot of ways, with this whole pin-up bomber girl aesthetic. And that's a huge part of what drew me to it, apart from the whole alternate history and mecha and everything else, which I think it does really well. And Modiphius got the RPG license, and they produced an RPG. Now, it has some mechanics issues and other things as well with it. It's very whiffy, which is RPG parlance for that. You fail a lot. It's really difficult for it to feel that kind of high-octane pulp way, which is what drew me to it anyway. So it's a kind of system genre mismatch. But the other problem with it, for all that you can see the woman on the cover there, the pin-up aesthetic is barely present in the book. There's miniature shots, there's a lot of grimy, muddy, brown-looking pictures of machinery and mechs and stuff like that. But one of the big visual appeals of the game, this pin-up aesthetic, is virtually missing. There are like 2, maybe 3 images. And this despite reusing quite a bit of art from other Dust products. That pin-up art is missing. Why? I don't know. It's a huge part of the visual appeal and the uniqueness of the product. It's hard to pin down exactly why they shied away from using that so much. I mean, it's basically built for promotion at events and things in Europe. The Dust Tactics guys from the miniature war game that started it all, they often have cosplayers there dressed as their pin-up characters, and it certainly draws a lot of attention and photographs and everything. A lot of their promotional material has it. There's wallpapers of one of their characters, Koshka. It's a big part of what really sells the game and the setting. In one image you can see you've got the rockabilly ethos, the rock and roll ethos, the pin-up aesthetic, and the kind of pulp World War II ongoing alternate history thing. You can see it all in a single image of a pin-up, and that's really good. But for whatever reason, they seem to have shied away from that. And this seems to be a pattern of behaviour. If you look to how they've handled the Conan license, when I think of Conan, I think of the Arnie movies, I think of Frazetta, I think of all these great fantasy artists who, a lot of them cut their teeth on Conan. And it has a particular sword and sandals and, frankly, bare breasts aesthetic. Nudity, violence, all the rest of that. So you go into it with a certain expectation, and from the writing you get the same thing. You get this kind of a sexualized fantasy aesthetic, even though the writing at the time maybe shied away from that a little bit. It's implied. And yet you look at the Conan book, and it's not like the original novels and short stories and so on were lacking in strong women, pirates and so on. But you look at the book, and for every one slight nod to the fantasy artist greats of the past, of the way Conan has been presented in the past, of the comics and everything, for every one of those, there's 3 strong women, besting men, or hacking off limbs, or sewing themselves up, or whatever. So for everything that fits the long and storied history of the franchise, the expectations that people have, the aesthetic that the whole genre has, there's 3, 4, 5 images of something that feels out of place. And rather than being inclusive, what they've done to try and be inclusive has overwritten and overtaken the main thrust of the appeal of the game. We even have strategic weapons in the way of certain shots. Unintentional puns about axe wounds notwithstanding. It's just, again, that timidity, and maybe there's a good reason for that. The people that made the Conan board game got into a lot of trouble over some of the sexual aesthetic that they had in their game, and the miniatures and the quests and everything. There were articles about how terrible it was, which is nonsense, of course. And that game much better fit the aesthetic, the idiom of Conan as a whole. But Modiphius has shied away from that, whether that's due to some kind of internal political or artistic idea, whether it's due to fear, due to the way that other games companies have been treated, or whether it's due to this timidity, this faux progressivism idea. I don't know. Now that brings us finally to Barsoom, and Modiphius has the license. They're calling it the John Carter RPG, so I'm wondering if it's much more related to the film than the books or whatever else, whether that was part of the arrangement of the deal. I know ERB plays hardball, and I know Disney plays hardball, and these are the companies that own or as much as you can own a mostly public domain thing. These are the companies that own this, and so their requirements may be quite onerous. But looking at the initial material, I see a similar aesthetic, a similar timidity to that which I see in the Conan RPG, and that is a huge pity. If you go back to the sort of 70s and 80s recovers for the Barsoom books, you'll see that sexual element being much more present. I mean, it was there in the original books, and keep in mind how old they were. It's fairly scandalous. Now, a lot of pulp magazines and so on, you would see this nakedness and this sexuality, or near nakedness, on the covers that wasn't present at all in the stories. It was the other way around with Barsoom. On Barsoom, everyone is supposed to be naked. John Carter is supposed to be doing all his fighting and running around with his cock swinging in the breeze, wearing nothing but a jewelled harness. Deja Thoris is meant to be naked the whole time, apart from, a couple of glued-on sapphires or whatever. But the women in Barsoom aren't completely timid either. They're fierce and ferocious, though it isn't perhaps necessarily described the way people today would like. But where the progress in the art and everything of the 70s and 80s was forward, much more liberated, much more sexually free, now we seem to be moving backwards again, rather than continuing forwards and being more accepting and so on. You would think in the environment of the, bearing down on 2020, you'd think in that environment, as opposed to the 1920s, we would be more advanced, more open, more sexually liberated and so on, and instead we seem to be backpedaling further back than the whole sexual liberation of the 60s and 70s, and this is concerning and worrying. We have an opportunity today, you would think, to present a more authentic at least, vision of Barsoom, of the whole Martian Chronicles, the Barsoom stories, but we don't. Like I say, I'm going to back it anyway, but I am worried, especially after looking at what they did with Dust and what they did with Conan, that we're just going to get another timid, watered down, fearful, women-friendly product that's not going to reflect the original source material, that's not going to be respectful of the original source material, and won't exploit that today should be much more sexually and artistically open than the period in which these novels were originally written. And that is a huge missed opportunity, and not something I really want to see. That said, I appreciate to an extent how these things can be. Even when working on gore, I would rather have gone completely full bore. I would have rather had much more strong and obvious depictions of sex, of BDSM, of all of that in my book. But the agent and the author wanted to de-emphasize that a little bit, and so you have to negotiate. But I pushed it about as far as I felt I was able to. But here, from what we've seen so far, in Conan and in Dust, it seems like the role-playing company is much more fearful than the source material or the older depictions that we've seen. And like I say, that's a shame and a pity and a missed opportunity. But that's just my perspective, and I'm a hairy old pervert, so who cares what I think, eh? I just like the history, and I would rather see authentic depictions. Zang.